It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
Welcome to Rico Brogna. How we doing today? We got a lot to discuss on episode number, I don't know, just a very high number. But we do appreciate you consuming the Rico, whether you download it, wherever you download podcasts, or you're watching it via YouTube on the WFAN page. We appreciate it. A couple of things we will discuss. I'll give you some menu items on today's Rico Brogna. The Edwin Diaz trade now is official. I know the trade was made close to 7.5 years ago, but now that Edwin Diaz is no longer a Met, we've all had a chance to digest it for the last month and a half. I thought today would be the great day to kind of go through where this trade ranks in Mets history. There have been a lot of really good trades in Met history. There have been some duds. And now that we have a finality to the Edwin Diaz trade, we are going to figure out where it falls in the history of the franchise. And not only that, I've gotten many requests for some archives of Joe and I talking about old Met things. Well, we have gone into the archives and we have found our initial reaction to the Edwin Diaz trade. What did we think? What was going through our minds? Were Joe and I arguing about it? Believe it or not, we were. There are some interesting aspects of our initial reaction to the Edwin Diaz trade, and so we will play that a little bit later on. Let me start off with some current stuff. Number one, Harrison Bader going to the San Francisco Giants. There's two angles to this. Number one, I'm glad he's not with the Phillies. No doubt about it. And I think the Philly fan is probably going through it as much as we were going through it back in December. Like, they are not happy with their offseason. And losing Harrison Bader, who was such a good addition for them after the trade deadline, and losing him on a reasonable contract, especially when you've got pretty much a crappy outfield, is surprising. And when Sean Morash broke the Bader news to us on Monday on Evan and Tiki, my reaction was anybody but the Phillies. So I was glad to see he didn't go back to Philly. As far as we're concerned, Bader signed for a contract that was less than I thought. I think I openly speculated here on the Rico of a 2-year, $30 million deal, something in that nature. He got the 2 years, so that part I was accurate about. But he's making less money than that. He's making $10.5 million, and it is totally fair to say, hey, Evan, would that have been better than Luis Robert Jr.? Here's my answer to this. The upside on Robert Jr. remains higher. There is a chance, even if you don't think it's a good chance, there is a chance, because of Robert's age, because of what he's shown in his past, that there's more to unlock with Luis Robert Jr. With that said, there's a floor. And the floor we've seen from him is, A, missing a bunch of games the last 2 seasons, and obviously not being productive. I like this risk because I think the reward is higher. We talked about Bader. I didn't mind going after Bader, but we connected Bader and Robert Jr. kind of in that same sentence. If they don't get Robert Jr., is Bader the right pivot? And he would have been. But I've said this a lot about Harrison Bader, and he proved me wrong last year, and he deserves nothing but credit. I still view him mostly as a fourth outfielder. Now, Hoff has told me that the Bader family doesn't like when I say that. I apologize. I don't mean to be a bad guy. The Bader family could think I'm more than I'm basically a fill-in host. I shouldn't be on all the time at the Fan. And that's fine. That's a great opinion to have. So if I view that way of Bader, which I do, then wouldn't you want the higher upside player in Robert Jr.? And I do. They gave up something. I get that. Luis Angel Acuna, who could have been a nice piece on this team. But if you're giving me the choice between Bader on a 2-year deal and potentially Robert Jr. on a 2-year deal, with Robert Jr. making double the amount of money, I think the risk is definitely higher because two things can happen. Robert Jr. could stink. He can be hurt. Acuna can become a ball player. But the reward is that Robert Jr. gets unlocked in this Met locker room, on this Met roster, with a real baseball team. As much as we mock the Mets, they ain't the White Sox. And so it goes back to, can they get the most out of Robert Jr.? I think they can. So if you ask me, I like what the Mets did in center field compared to just signing Bader to a 2-year contract. Number 2, Carlos Mendoza. He did a few interviews. He did one with Joel Sherman and John Heyman. He did one on the Foul Territory show. And there were 2 things that came out of it. One, I'm not going to waste your time with. I did it on Evan and Tiki. I joke with Tiki. There are certain topics that are Rico topics. There are certain things that are Evan and Tiki topics. I think when we get really, really geeky, baseball related, it's a Rico. When it's on the surface, I don't even care about the Mets, but I'm interested, it's probably more Evan and Tiki. So we discussed the locker room stuff, which quite frankly, I'm sick of talking about here. And I don't think most Met fans who listen to this podcast care about it anymore. We get it. We have our opinions. It's over. So if you want to hear me and Tiki talk about what Mendy said about the Met locker room, Tuesday, Evan and Tiki, we did it at around noon, if memory serves correct, or maybe it was 11 a.m. Either way, download that podcast. Basically, Mendy said, I'll summarize it real quick and move on, that the locker room was maybe too buttoned up, too corporate, and that guys didn't celebrate enough with each other. Whatever, okay? It doesn't matter anymore. I'm done doing the autopsy on 2025. But what he did say that is very Rico-like is the lineup. And I was surprised that when John Heyman brought up, hey, what are you going to do with 1, 2, 3? I was surprised that Carlos Mendoza actually gave an answer. So, ladies and gentlemen, here is Carlos Mendoza from his interview with John Heyman, talking about how he envisions 1, 2, 3 in the Mets lineup looking like on opening day.
It's too early, but I've been playing around some potential lineups. Everyone has to be healthy, obviously, and there's got to be conversations with players. But as I'm sitting here talking to you guys, I could see a Lindor, Soto, Bo out of the gate. Then you're looking at Polanco, Semien, whoever's in the lineup. There's a lot of versatility. There's a lot of flexibility. I like the fact that there's a balance. I could put together a very balanced lineup, whether it's righties, lefties, the switch hitting from Lindor and Polanco. It allows me to protect certain guys. So I like our lineup 1 through 9. But since you asked about those 3, I feel really good about it.
I am not surprised that was his answer. Like, there are 2 games we could play. There's the what would your lineup be, and what do I think Mendy will do. I think he definitely was always going to lean towards Lindor 1, Soto 2, Bichette 3. My quibble with it is that I am so intrigued by Juan Soto leading off. I always have been. Because, and maybe I've become too new age. Maybe that's my problem. Maybe I'm too much into 2026 and not enough in 1997. But Juan Soto gets on base, and I think he will get on base 40% of the time, which is an absurd number, which is amongst the league leaders. He also showed you last year he can steal a base, right? He showed you that last year. I love the idea of giving Bo Bichette and Francisco Lindor RBI opportunities, and they'll get more of them with Juan Soto leading off because Juan Soto will just get on base more. Lindor's a hell of a player. Lindor can lead off on most teams. Lindor's not getting on base 40% of the time. He's just not. So I am enamored by it. Now, Mendy hasn't done it yet, and Soto's basically never done it in his career. And I don't know what Soto thinks of it. That is a very fair question to say, hey, do you think Juan Soto would have a problem with that? I have no idea, and no one's asked him. I mean, I'd ask him if I get a chance to talk to him. The problem is, when we go to spring training for the Rico, more details on that later, it's in the middle of the WBC, so he's probably not even going to be there. So I'll leave like a telegram for him. But that's my thinking, for those that disagree. My thinking is, he's going to get on base at such an absurd amount of time, that I want to just create as many RBI opportunities as possible for Lindor and Bichette. Now, obviously, with his lineup, Bichette's batting third, so he'll come up with guys on base, but he'll come up with more guys on base if Soto's leading off, followed by Lindor. Now, why do I say that? Well, here's how I say it. If Lindor's already on, there's less of a chance Soto's going to work a walk. And I'm not negative about the walk. I like it. If your leadoff man is on, your chances of scoring increase greatly. They just do. It's a numbers game. So I don't know if Mendy will ever do it. This is just his initial reaction on the lineup. But if it was up to me, it's just me speaking, I would have Juan Soto leading off, and I would go either Bo 2, Lindor 3, or Lindor 2, Bo 3. As far as the rest of the lineup is concerned, I'm not surprised about that, whether it's Semien 4 or Polanco 4. I think that Alvarez and Robert Jr. are the 2 guys that if they mash, Vientos as well if he plays, if those guys mash, they can absolutely move up and end up as the cleanup hitter. It is not a crazy thought that eventually, and that's the key word, eventually they end up as the cleanup hitter. But I think to start, the veterans like Polanco and Semien deserve that. I would hit Robert Jr. ninth. That's just me. I would take all the pressure off of him. Plus, remember this about Luis Robert Jr. He steals bases, right? He has shown an ability to do that. I love that in the 9-hole because now all of a sudden you're getting more guys in scoring position potentially for your RBI guys. Okay, so that's my thinking about that. That's the situation with the lineup. Now, let's get to trades. All right, one of the generic Ricos we could always do every offseason is breaking down the greatest trades in the history of the New York Mets. And depending on your age, depending on your emotions, your opinions may vary on what is the greatest trade in the history of the New York Mets. What I wanted to do today was go through kind of the top 10 trades in Met history to give us perspective on where the Edwin Diaz trade should fall. Now, here's my view on trades. Even though Edwin Diaz signed a contract at the end of the 2022 season, I feel like it's connected. You know, like if the Mets re-sign Freddie Peralta, it's connected to the trade. There's no guarantee they were just going to sign him as a free agent. Same goes with Mike Piazza. Same goes with Johan Santana. Those are two guys the Mets traded for. And in Piazza's case, a few months later, they signed him right before he entered free agency. It was during that window before free agency. And in the case of Johan Santana, they traded for him, and in the days around trading for him, extended him immediately. Same thing with Francisco Lindor. Like, if you disqualify a trade because that guy ended up signing a new contract, then you're eliminating a lot of freaking trades. You know what I'm talking about? So Diaz's trade continued, in my view, even through the contract that he signed. Now that he's gone, it's over. Now that he signed, it's all done, right? All the other pieces that were in the Edwin Diaz trade, the Anthony Swarzaks of the world, the Jay Bruces of the world. I mean, it's amazing to think about all the crap that was in that trade. Oh, Robbie Cano too. I can't forget that because that was the headline when the trade was made. Obviously, that stuff is finished. We all know what those guys did. But in the case of Edwin Diaz, the moment he signed that contract with the LA Dodgers, the trade was over. What I'm also going to do is there's a lot of times when I talk about history and I'm honest and I say, hey, look, I wasn't alive for this or I don't remember this. So I'm not ignoring it, but I'm putting it to the side because I can't judge it fairly. I'm not doing that today. I'm going to be a fair historian. The Tommy Agee trade and the Don Clendenon trade and the Keith Hernandez trade, they need to be discussed. I get that when Keith Hernandez was traded to the Mets, I was still a month away from being born. I trust me, I get it. Same thing with Tommy Agee. It wasn't a month. It was about 16 years before I was born. So we're going to look at all these trades, the impact it had, and in your mind, compare it to what Edwin Diaz did. And we're going to find out where this trade ranks in Mets history. Let's start with Tommy Agee. So this was all the way back in 1967. It was the offseason of 67 into 68. Obviously, the Mets stink. You know, we all know that. I guess you could feel the young players that are emerging and the potential for this team to get good in a couple of years. They traded for Tommy Agee and Al Weiss, who was a part of the 69 team. So we have to include him in this trade that was made. They traded away Buddy Booker, Tommy Davis, and Tommy Davis was really good prior to coming to the Mets. He was with the Dodgers. He was an all-star. He played well early in his career, but after his time with the Mets and beyond, Tommy Davis stunk. He was a utility player. Fat Jack Fisher, who, what I remember about Fat Jack Fisher is that Gary Cohen thought it was offensive to call him fat when he referenced Jack Fisher a couple of years ago. And then Billy Wynn. So let's be honest, the Mets gave up nothing, and they got Tommy Agee, who was here for a bunch of years, big part of the 69 team, and they got Al Weiss. We put that trade up on the, hey, that was damn good. Now, I'll give you an annoying stat for those that appreciate the stat and also want more of a frame of reference on the impact that Tommy Agee made. He finished with a WAR of 14, which is 23rd in the history of the New York Mets. If you don't care about that, that is totally fine. Just ignore that part of the podcast. But for those that want more context, I do want to give you that information. The other trade in the earlier time in Met history, and this is one where it gets pushed up even with numbers that don't jump out at you, and that's when they acquired Don Clendenon at the trade deadline in 1969. They acquired Don Clendenon. They traded Steve Renko, who was basically a pitcher that bounced around, Kevin Collins, and 2 minor leaguers that never made it for Don Clendenin. And if you look at Clendenin's numbers after his trade from Montreal, they were fine. They were okay. But what makes him the legend is that he's the World Series MVP in 1969. And automatically, when you're the World Series MVP for our franchise, that trade goes right to the top. So even though when you compare his WAR to others or his greater impact in Met history statistically, it is not going to be up there with many of the others, again, World Series MVP. And the other thing that obviously needs to be explained to me more so by my dad or Joe B or those that remember it is Don Clendenin didn't play in the NLCS. He only played in the World Series and hit .354 and hit 3 home runs. So I can't explain all of it, but that's a trade that right off the top, I don't need to even give you numbers. They made a trade at the trade deadline, and that guy won World Series MVP. That ain't bad. Now let's jump up to 1983, because we got a lot of bad trades in the 70s that we're going to leave out. We're not talking about the Midnight Massacre and trading Tom Seaver away. That's for another podcast. That's for a different one, different day. The Keith Hernandez trade, where the New York Mets on June 15th, 1983, acquired Keith Hernandez for Rick Ownby and Neil Allen. When you look at Ownby and Neil Allen and their careers, they are nothings. So they did not give up any mega prospect that turned into anything. They received a former MVP, and they also received a guy who not only finished with a WAR as a Met of 26.6, the 6th highest in the history of the franchise. So statistically, not too bad. They changed the franchise. And we're going to get into Mike Piazza in a second. What always bothered me as a historian of the Mets, not even as someone who's experienced it, is that Mike Piazza is perceived as he changed the Mets. Well, hold on a second. He may have changed the perception. He may have changed the box office. But in 1997, the year before Mike got here, the Mets won 88 games. The year Mike got here, they won 88 games. Keith Hernandez came to the Mets in the midst of 1983, in which the Mets were going through their darkest period in their franchise's history. The following year, they went from being one of the worst to being in a legitimate pennant race in 1984, to then being in a really legitimate pennant race in 1985, to being the world effing champions in 1986. Keith Hernandez changed the franchise on a much greater scale than Mike Piazza. Now, we could argue who was statistically the superior player upon coming here. It's very different. Mike's a Hall of Famer. Keith Hernandez may get there. He isn't. And that's not a disrespect on Keith. It's more, I get the player that Mike was, but Keith Hernandez changed the franchise. I don't think there's any question. I mean, those who experienced it and the shock of the trade certainly know it, but even the numbers back that up. Let me get to Gary Carter, because the numbers don't back up Gary Carter's trade as being one of the great trades in the history of the franchise, but he was the final piece. And that certainly needs to be qualified for a lot. They traded for him on December 10th, 1984. Hubie Brooks, Mike Fitzgerald, Herb Winningham, and Floyd Yeomans went to the Montreal Expos. That was another stunner. I mean, you're getting a future Hall of Famer, a catcher in the prime of his career. And really, the difference between Keith and Gary is that Keith was the piece that helped change things, and Gary was the final piece. But his WAR ended up finishing at 11.4, 29th in the history of the franchise. And I hate to say this, his WAR finished behind Kevin McReynolds, which I'm not going to include on this list, right? Are we going to include Kevin McReynolds' trade as one of the great trades in the history of the franchise? So it shows you, while I'm going to give you numbers, numbers can also lie to you, and they're not always the complete, most accurate statement on a great trade. This is a great trade, acquiring Gary Carter. I just don't know if I can put it above Keith Hernandez. And the answer is I can't put it above Keith Hernandez. Now let's get to Piazza, because I just talked about him. Jeff Getz, Preston Wilson, and Ed Yarnell went to the Florida Marlins on May 22nd, 1998. Piazza finished with a 24.6 WAR, 9th in the history of the franchise, so slightly behind Keith Hernandez. Obviously, WAR was a much nicer stat to Keith than it was Mike, because he was a lumbering catcher who was not a good defender and was as slow as molasses, but he was a game-changing bat. Now, I didn't mean to put Mike down when I talked about the impact of the trade. It was very impactful. I mean, where this franchise was in 1998 was it was missing a star. So the idea of it changing the Mets was more about the box office and the perception than it was the reality of wins and losses. Now, I think it was a necessary trade because did the Mets win 88 games in 1998 without Mike? No. Are they in the NLCS in 1999 without Mike? No. If they ran it back with Todd Hundley, hoping he was going to just get healthy, the Mets would not have been better off. So I am not arguing that they weren't clearly better off trading for Piazza. It is an all-time trade. I just want to point out, as someone who experienced it, unlike the Keith thing, which I admit, I loved the trade. I was ecstatic. I remember where I was when they made the trade. So for me personally, it's up there as one of the greatest trades in the history of the franchise. But I do think it's a little bit of a misconception because they did win 88 games a year prior. And the Mets' fortunes were changing upon making that trade. Preston Wilson was tough to give up. I think a part of it was because he was the son of Mookie, and he had come up. He'd made his major league debut. We were high on Preston Wilson. Reality is Preston had a nice little major league career. He never turned into the star we thought he was. But Mike Piazza, the trade, we all have the memories. I've told this story before. I was at the old number 6 school playing basketball, and we had the boombox on listening to Mike and the Mad Dog. That is the most 1998 thing you could do. Boombox playing basketball, the fan. And when they broke the news on the trade, I immediately sprinted home to call my dad and tell him, I can't believe we got Mike Piazza. And I think the joke we had for many years was, I can't believe Mike Piazza was a Met. And he was. The other trade that was in that time frame that we need to reference as a great trade, and I was almost surprised by the highness of the WAR, which I guess shows you WAR is a misleading stat, though I use it anyway, was the Al Leiter trade. Al Leiter actually finished with a WAR of 28, the 5th highest for a pitcher in the history of the franchise, behind the likes of Jacob deGrom and Tom Seaver and guys like that. The negative to Leiter, and this is the first time I'm bringing this up in regards to a trade, is that you could argue they lost the trade. Because one of the pieces that went back to Florida was A.J. Burnett, who put together a really good career. Would A.J. Burnett have materialized in New York? I don't know. He ended up coming back to New York many years later, a decade later, pitching for the New York Yankees. And I think Yankee fans have mixed views on how they view A.J. Burnett. And obviously the Mets' success in 98, 99, 2000, it doesn't happen without Leiter and A.J. Burnett here. But in fairness, this is the first time we got to a trade where it hurt, man. And there were trades like that. I mean, we're all talking about Freddie Peralta. It is possible that Brandon Sproat has a better career than Freddie Peralta. But if Freddie Peralta is here for the next 5-6 years, gets an extension, and the Mets win a World Series or even lose a World Series but get there, and Freddie Peralta is the unquestioned ace, I don't know how much we'll be killing it. And so I think Al Leiter can serve the same. But hey, statistically, in terms of what Al gave the Mets and the way he contributed to the change in this franchise, it was a huge addition. David Cohn, that's another one. And I certainly don't want to forget that. And maybe you thought I did because we're going out of order a little bit. But Ed Hearn for David Cohn is the example of a trade that is as one-sided as humanly possible. And a team that's desperate. I guess the Royals were desperate for a catcher. So they traded for Ed Hearn, who had filled in for an injured Gary Carter at one point. And the Mets got back David Cohn, who has the 8th highest WAR in the history of the New York Mets from a starting pitcher. I think what's unfortunate for David is, unlike some of these others, there's no World Series appearance. There were some great years. I mean, some unbelievable seasons. And Met fans really like David Cohn. We think of him fondly. And claim to fame now for David Cohn is he was traded for a Hall of Famer. when we traded him to Toronto for Ryan Thompson and Jeff Kent. Some other trades. This is where things are going to get uncomfortable. All right, it's just, I want to be fair. The Armando Benitez trade. Yeah, it's one of the great trades the Mets ever made. If you don't remember this one, this was a 3-way trade where the Mets traded Todd Hundley. Todd Hundley ended up in Los Angeles. Armando Benitez. Did Todd Hundley end up in L.A.? Charles Johnson end up in L.A.? I'm now forgetting where everybody ended up. But bottom line was Todd Hundley was shipped out, and we got back Roger Cedeno, who put together an incredible rookie season in 1999, and Armando Benitez. I'll do this real quick because it's painful but true. Armando Benitez pitched 5 years with the New York Mets. Edwin Diaz pitched 6. Okay. Armando Benitez threw 347 innings, Edwin Diaz 328. I think a big part of that is obviously the year that Diaz missed and also the pandemic season. So I think the innings pitched were certainly impacted by those two things. Armando got 160 saves. Edwin Diaz got 144. I would almost say that's a wash because I think there were a lot of non-saves Diaz could have gotten, but because Buck Showalter used him in the eighth inning, which I loved, there were saves that were not there. I think the closer was used a little bit differently in Diaz's era, so I would argue the saves are pretty much a wash. And when it comes to ERA, 2.93 for Edwin, 2.70 for Armando. When it comes to WAR, 9.8 for Armando, 8.5 for Edwin Diaz. Armando Benitez statistically was slightly better than Edwin Diaz in his major league career with the New York Mets. But there's a huge but coming. The difference between Diaz and Benitez was the moment. The moment always felt too big for Armando Benitez. Now, Edwin wasn't perfect. I don't want to make it out like he was. He blew a game in Game 2 of the NLDS against the Philadelphia Phillies. Game 161 against Atlanta. He had his bad moments, but unlike Armando, I believe Edwin Diaz had more good moments. And when you look at his postseason resume, which we went through a couple of months ago, I forget what the context was about Edwin Diaz, but we were going through his postseason history. Oh, it was against Armando Benitez. I think I actually compared the two, if I'm not mistaken. That's where Diaz has the edge. There was a trust between us and Edwin Diaz that never existed between Armando Benitez and us. And that's why, even though I'll give you the stats, I'll be honest, and they also got Roger Cedeno in that trade, which is pretty damn good compared to what we got in the Edwin Diaz trade, which was Robinson Cano getting busted for juice multiple times. Edwin Diaz was still a better trade than Armando Benitez, but it goes to show you that Benitez is a... Look, I don't like him, so I'm not arguing with myself here, but he doesn't get the regular season credit that maybe he deserves. That's how I would frame it, because I don't love him. And I think I pretty much explained why I don't. The big moment matters, and he wasn't there for the big moment. But statistically, he was a very good regular season closer. It was what it was. The Johan Santana trade is another good one, but it's complicated because the Johan Santana era didn't live up to what we had hoped. I think in 2008, he was everything we wanted. Torn meniscus, 3 days rest on that Saturday against the Marlins. It certainly wasn't his fault. He had a wonderful season that year. But the rest of his Met career, for the most part, was riddled by injury. And that's what makes it difficult. They didn't end up giving up a lot unless we're freaking out about a perfect game that was pitched by Philip Humber. But I can't put it as an all-time great trade when you factor in that the Santana era didn't live up to all our hopes. But he has two great moments in the history of the franchise. He's got the torn meniscus game on 3 days rest, and obviously the no-hitter, which means a lot to all of us. The other one that's up there, even if I think at a moment it looked greater than it ended up, was the R.A. Dickey trade. They trade R.A. Dickey, coming off a Cy Young, but being old, a 38-year-old knuckleballer, and they turn it into Noah Syndergaard and Travis d'Arnaud. I think the issue is the Syndergaard run ended sadly. It ended with him not fully fulfilling the potential. Same thing with Travis d'Arnaud. But what we cannot deny is that both of those guys were key cogs in going to a World Series. Are they in the World Series if they don't make that trade? And the answer is probably no. But I think if we had this conversation in 2018, we would have talked about this as an all-time Met trade. I don't think it ends up there, but it ends up pretty good. But what does end up as an all-time trade was the trade that was made on July 31st, 2015, the Yoenis Cespedes trade. Stats won't back this up because Yoenis Cespedes finished 45th in the history of the franchise in WAR at just 7.5, which is not exactly that high for the years that he was here. But the reason Yoenis Cespedes moves up a notch, and in a weird way, it's similar to the Don Clendenon thing, where you could throw all the numbers out with Clendenon. It's about being the World Series MVP. It's tough to match that, is the fact that Yoenis Cespedes, I think, almost single-handedly put this team on his back after that trade, not only did he change the perception, but he changed that lineup completely, and we ran away with the National League East. And what we gave up felt like a lot because Michael Fulmer had a good year or two with Detroit. But after that, he fell off. He's been bouncing around the league as a reliever, and Luis Sessa. So it didn't sting in terms of what they gave up, or at least what it turned out to be what they gave up. And Cespedes, in the short term, had one of the great impacts you'll ever have. I mean, in the short term, he was as good of a trade deadline deal as you can make. He'll fall short behind Clendenon for the reasons we gave earlier. You win the World Series. That's the end-all, be-all. But, I mean, that's an all-timer. I'm going to keep Lindor to the side because there'll be a day in which we break down the Lindor trade. That trade is still ongoing, but clearly that is going to be a win. It's just a matter of how high it jumps up the ladder. Does it pass Keith Hernandez? Does it pass the Don Clendenon? Does it pass Mike Piazza? I think the jury is still out on how high it goes, but I don't think there's any doubt when you look at what they gave up and you look at what Lindor has already done for this franchise, that's an all-time trade. So where does Edwin Diaz fall? It's up there. I mean, is it ahead of Piazza? No. It won't be ahead of Lindor. I can't put it ahead of Cespedes because of the impact it had in getting us to the World Series. I can't put it ahead of Clendenon. I think this exercise for me, and you guys can tell me whether it's the email, the ricob@gmail.com or the comments or wherever, I think the greatest trade in the history of the franchise based on this exercise we're doing is still Keith Hernandez. I have a tough time really putting any other trade above that one. The Clendenon one's the best argument because it's boom, trade deadline, World Series MVP. But Keith Hernandez was the U-turn for the franchise. Or the left turn for the franchise. I'm not sure what the best analogy would be. Like, that's the trade that just changed everything. But what I think we could agree on the Diaz trade is it was a major win. Now, let me go through the pieces because I think we forget how many players were involved, and then we'll listen to what Joe and I said upon the trade being made. The New York Mets acquired Edwin Diaz and Robinson Cano, as well as cash from the Seattle Mariners for Gerson Batista, Jay Bruce, Justin Dunn, Jared Kelenic, and Anthony Swarzak. Jared Kelenic was the one that scared us. Jared Kelenic is still in baseball, but he is a career .211 hitter. And with Seattle, he was a career .204 hitter. And let this be a lesson for me. I admit, for me, in talking about the Peralta trade and being a prospect hugger, even though I claim I'm not. That's where it doesn't always work out to where we fear. Obviously, Pete Crow Armstrong did. And if we ever talk about bad trades, which we will at some point, obviously the Javi Baez trade and the mixed kind of emotions of that trade, because it did work out in the short term, but obviously long term, the Mets are still feeling it. In this case, the prospects they gave up, and Justin Dunn was a prospect as well, did not pan out. But there were a lot of pieces going on. And I went back into the archives, and great work by Andrew Kaplan, who works here, who was able to find all the audio, and we tried to edit a little bit of it because Joe and I went on for a long time talking about this trade. And I was very opinionated. You'll hear with Joe, he was very much, I don't know who this Diaz guy is. Like, he was very open about it. Like, yeah, I know he had a good year. I don't know this guy. He's been around for 1 year. What do I think? I remember that this, to me, was always the Edwin Diaz trade, but initially it was presented as the Robbie Cano trade. And you can understand why. Robbie's history with the Yankees, the amount of money he makes, the star power. That was the headline. But immediately to me, it was, no, they traded for this 24-year-old relief pitcher who has a chance to be great, who has a chance to be our next great closer. So let's go back into the WFN archives and take a listen to Benengo and Roberts. This is from 2018. This is November 30th, 2018, if memory serves correct. Us breaking down our initial reaction to the Edwin Diaz trade.
But in the short term, this trade makes the Mets a better team in 2019. That's not debatable.
No.
Now, my concern about Edwin Diaz, it's the same concern I'd have about any relief pitcher.
Of course.
He's a relief pitcher.
No question about it. That's the best part of Edwin Diaz is that he's only 24 years old.
Yes.
That's it. He's not 34. He's 24. You would think the best of him is yet to come. You would think.
And considering the year he had last year, that gets me excited if the best of him is yet to come.
And the bullpen, as you brought it up, especially if they go out and bring another arm in. I'd love to see Andrew Miller. I don't know if that's probably won't happen. But
no. Why?
Because it's the Mets.
No.
I want him. I want him.
Yes, Andrew Miller. Go back to this. The Mets are trying to win right now.
Okay.
They need another reliever. This can't just be it.
I understand.
And if you sign Andrew Miller,
I'd be delirious with that sign. It's very few relief pitches that would excite me for bringing him here. Relief pitches don't excite me. Andrew Miller would excite me,
especially when he comes here as the second guy setting up for Edwin Diaz.
And just the multiple, the versatility of him as a relief pitcher.
Yes. They need to add another relief pitcher.
Completely. It's only lengthened by Gazelman and Lugo being there.
Here's the thing about a young reliever who had a dominant
Who, by the way, could also move in. With that happening, one of them could move into the rotation to be the back end of the rotation instead of the brutal Jason Vargas.
It's an option. I lean towards no, but it's an option.
Right.
Definitely an option.
Right.
When you look at young relievers, I'll give you two guys, and this is where the Diaz thing can go. There's Ken Giles. Ken Giles had a dominant year for the Philadelphia Phillies. He was great. He was 23, 24 years old, and they shipped him out to Houston. They got a lot back, and Giles was never nearly as good to the point where he's beating himself up walking off the mound.
Right.
He's never turned out
Which
to be.
Like you said, you never know. Diaz, you never know, could happen that way with him. We don't know.
He could be Ken Giles.
Right.
He could be Kenley Jansen. Kenley Jansen has been really good for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. That's a long time for relief pitching.
No kidding it is.
5 years of solid relief pitching is a long time.
Craig Kimbrell has been really good for a long time.
Even though I think he's on the downside.
But we're not talking about the downside Kimbrell. We're talking about 24-year-old Kimbrell because that's the hope of what Diaz can be.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
I understand that. Yes,
and that's the thing. Because I've heard a lot of people say, but guys, they could have just signed the closer. Zach Britton is 31. Craig Kimbrell is 30 and has a ton of innings on his arm.
And this guy's not making any money, Diaz.
Yeah, right. And you have to give them a big contract.
Right.
Those guys have a lot of mileage and more likely than not turn into Frankie Rodriguez. And what that means is that Frankie Rodriguez was a better Angel than he ever was a Met.
Right, than anything.
You want a guy who's going to give you his prime. Forget Cano. This isn't about Cano. That's the hope with Diaz. And that's the difference between Diaz versus Kimbrell. You said it. You just did. Kimbrell's on the downside.
Yeah, I don't love him.
I'd rather have Diaz than Kimbrell.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Definitely.
I'd rather have Diaz than any reliever on the free agent market. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, I still like Andrew Miller a lot.
Not as much as Diaz. Come on, Andrew Miller has been banged up.
But here's the difference.
30s.
I will say, because I know what Andrew Miller is. I still don't quite know what this guy is, as good as he might have been last year. Is that a fair thing to say?
It's sort of not fair because Andrew Miller wasn't good last year.
Okay.
So what do you know that he is?
Well, like I said, I like him. He excites me, and I don't get excited by relief.
That's not the point. I like him, too. I'm saying that last year at 33, he had a 4.5 ERA. That's what I'm saying.
I understand.
So how do you know what he is?
Okay.
That's all.
Okay. But there's also no guarantee that Diaz is going to be what he was last year. I don't know that.
Do you think there's a better chance that Diaz is what he was last year than Andrew Miller finds himself at 34 years old and pitches to a 1.5 ERA like he did?
That's a tough call.
Oh, I would definitely lean towards the young guy. Miller's 33, 34.
All right. But 33-year-old pitchers aren't exactly, brutal at 33. You can still recover at 33.
Absolutely.
Especially a guy that's not, not a starter.
I didn't ask you if he could recover or not. He can. I'm saying one has a better chance of happening.
Well,
Diaz versus Miller.
I mean, Diaz upside is better. I'll give you that.
That's all I'm saying.
The upside for Diaz is better.
And by the way,
I would agree with.
So, and I'll end this with an agreement with you. They need to add a reliever. We all still agree with that?
Yes.
The number one reliever I would add in free agency now that I have Diaz is Andrew Miller.
Okay.
Despite those concerns. And I have concerns.
That would be tremendous. I'm in.
Now let's see him do it.
Well, let's see him do a lot of things.
We'll get
not trade Syndergaard for nothing.
Well, they didn't add Andrew Miller. That was so interesting because there's so many things to take out of it. How about Craig Kimbrell? We're talking about how he's on the downside in November of 2018. Here we are 7.5 years later, and the Mets invited Craig Kimbrell to spring training. Obviously, they didn't bring him in on a big-time contract, but that does make me laugh. And just so you know, Andrew Miller was done. And I didn't expect it, even though I was arguing with Joe about it. I didn't think he was done. I just didn't think I'd be as certain about Andrew Miller as I would about Diaz. And the truth is, both guys sucked in 2019. I guess Joe won the argument because Diaz sucked more, but Andrew Miller was not great in 2019. And then he was basically done It was the end of Andrew Miller. Maybe all the innings that Terry Francona used him for and the Yankees prior used him for, maybe that did him in. But it's crazy. We said 5 good years from Edwin Diaz. That's what he gave the Mets. He was here for 7 seasons, okay? One of which he did not pitch due to injury. So we'll throw that away, but he was here for 7 seasons, even if one he did not pitch in. There was one season in which, and I can't blame him for it, there was a pandemic. He pitched, he was really good, wasn't a full season. But we'll include that as a good year. I don't know how we can't. He really had the one horrible season of 2019. Now, was he great in 2021? No. Was he great even in 2024? No, it was not his best seasons, but he was still relatively good, right? So ultimately, what Joe and I were asking for all those years ago was, can he give this franchise 5 good years? The answer was yes. He was here for 7. 5 of them were either really, really good or good. And so it worked. I think that's the grand finale on the Edwin Diaz trade. It worked. I do not think it gets to the top of the list. If the Mets would have won a World Series and Diaz is recording the final out and he's our Mariano Rivera, it's a different story. But it obviously worked. No doubt about it. And it was the Edwin Diaz trade, which at the time, if we were doing the Rico back in 2018, oh my God, it pissed me off. It's the Cano trade. It's the Cano trade. And there's a clip earlier, I didn't play it, but Joe was like, it's the Cano trade because that's who people are familiar with. And he was right. I wasn't arguing that. It was just, that's not the crux of it. The crux of it was the closer. So in grand conclusion, Brodie Van Wagenen, if you are listening, if you are out there right now, thank you. That's it. Nice little simple thank you. There were other things that maybe I didn't like, but in terms of this trade, your monster move as the GM of the New York Mets, it worked. It sucks that it didn't work for longer. That's on the current administration for not keeping him, but we got as much out of Edwin Diaz as I think we could have reasonably expected when that trade was made back in late November of 2018.
I'm listening to this conversation, and I will tell you, I don't know if you said it, so maybe I missed it because I was making some eggs. But where I would put this trade, because we never got to the series with him, but he was a major impact in certain areas. I put it near the Carlos Delgado trade.
Yeah.
Because Carlos Delgado was...
From Mike Jacobs. Remember that one?
Yeah.
I didn't even include that on this, but you're right. That was a very, very good trade. And I should have included it because it impacted them, like you said, not getting to a World Series, but at least having that success in 2006 and obviously not success in 7 and 8, but he was a huge part of that lineup. And ultimately, they didn't give up a lot in Mike Jacobs and Yusemo Petit.
Yes. And again, there were some seasons where he just kind of disappeared and fell off, and that's kind of like Edwin Diaz. He kind of was on the front end for Diaz, and Delgado's the back end. But that's where it is. Like, it was impactful, but they never really won anything with him. So.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is up there. By the way, we were mentioning WAR when going through the rankings, and that's why Delgado never appears. He was here for 4 years. His WAR was 4.8, which is just – it shows you the flaw in the stat. And that's why I always preface it when I use it. I use it because I think GMs use it. I think a lot of fans use it. And I think sometimes it's a nice frame of reference. But there are examples where it's completely flawed. Anyhow, your feedback on where the Edwin Diaz trade falls in Met history, you can certainly email us, thericob@gmail.com, thericob@gmail.com. Another Rico we are working on, I can't wait to do it, in regards to Met history and what we just experienced, is losing our players. Losing guys we love to free agency specifically. We'll do a whole Rico ranking and breaking down all the losses that we've suffered. And again, before any results have been put in, where the Edwin Diaz and Pete Alonso would fall in the whole story. So that's coming up in the next few days. And I do remind you, coming up before you know it, it's our Rico Rewatchable Part 2, the return of baseball to New York post 9/11. That game is all over YouTube. We'll put a link up in our description. Watch the game, and we'll do a whole Rico coming up on that in a few short weeks. We appreciate you listening, downloading, and subscribing to Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.